Naomi Shafer. I'm the executive director of Clowns Without Borders, and I'm so excited to be here with you on our Wednesday speaker series of topics and issues intersecting with Clowns Without Borders. Today, I am here with Claire Bennet. Claire Bennet is the co-author of this incredible book, Learning Service. We at CWB have been using this for a few years as a resource to prepare our volunteers, but also to think about how we do our work. It's about the ethics of volunteering and international aid. Claire, welcome. What did I miss from your introduction?
That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you. So I'd love to start by a quick overview of what is Learning Service and what inspired you to write it.
Okay, so Learning Service is it's kind of like a philosophy on volunteer travel. So we're going to be talking a lot about volunteer travel and some of the pitfalls, and really what kind of inspired us as a team of co-authors to write it was kind of witnessing let's just say that, like, the misfiring of good intentions, and not being the first people to kind of bring this up or criticize the way that international volunteering was done. Seeing a lot of kind of media attention sort of talking about how it's often done poorly, but also the idea of Learning Service was to sort of say, well, how can it be done well? So like in looking at all of the problems, thinking about how can we sort of capture the amazing kind of desires and positive intentions of people that want to engage with volunteer travel, and sort of funnel that into a way that's effective.
Thanks so much. So I want to start where the book starts, which is with the history of help. And something that I love about the framing of the book is that you go back and talk about how a lot of colonialist and tendencies were in this paternalistic mindset, this idea of helping, and we see that exist still in a lot of both international aid and volunteering. And I'm wondering if you could take us on a quick tour of the history, a quick lesson on the history of help.
Yeah, all right. Well, a really quick lesson. So, like, as you mentioned, taking this back to the roots of kind of colonial history can often be a sort of contentious place to start. I think because when we talk about colonialism, what people associate with that are, images of like, people going to war and spreading disease and all these really negative things. But something that we look at in the book is how a lot of the colonizers used a lot of really familiar rhetoric, about wanting to help or uplift or civilize overseas populations. And we even, we have quotes of people saying things like, they're sure that in the future they'll be thanked for their service and things like that. So really, we can take it right back to sort of 1492. The other sort of side of it that we look at is missionaries that also, went hand in hand with the process of colonization. They were sort of the friendly face of the colonizers. And, even though they, again, went with these really, sort of grandiose ideas of how they were helping, they still went assuming that, they knew what was best for local people, that their ideas were right and that they wanted to impose those ideas. So that was really sort of the early roots. And if we were going to look at, how does something like international volunteering that looks sort of similar to the form that we have today, how did that start? We really trace it back to 1901. there was a ship that sailed from the US to the Philippines, carrying a group of several hundred volunteers that were, they had, again, a very familiar task that we still see happening today, which was to teach English to local people as part of a colonial project. So, since then, really, we've seen this kind of thing be replicated, but it's really only been in the last, I would say, few decades where we've seen it kind of really proliferate and take off, and now it's like a really mainstream activity. It's like almost like a rite of passage for young people to want to go and volunteer overseas.
So speaking of young people going over and volunteering, it seems like one of the main audiences for the book are for young people who are maybe considering a gap year up until about, or people who are looking for more professional experience. And that's rarely the context of how we're working with volunteers in Clowns Without Borders, where we're working with artists who are already kind of established in their career of clowning. But one of the places that I had this, oh yes, this is a book that I'm definitely going to finish and use, is you cite a few examples of when those great intentions, those really great motivations and intentions go wrong. And I'm wondering if you could share one or two stories and examples of when you've seen projects fail and why.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this was a major impetus in writing the book, was witnessing, a lot of them firsthand, but then also through doing loads of research and interviewing, both volunteers and hosts, just finding so many different stories, but also uncovering patterns, things that were happening again and again. And, one of the things that we looked at about why, the sort of underlying causes of why these problems were happening was sort of, in a way, like inherent in the activity itself, in that, the idea of volunteer travel sits kind of uncomfortably in sort of two fields, or like on the cusp of two fields. One side being tourism, and the other side being sort of international development, where like the idea of tourism is that it's all set up for the traveller. It's about experiences for the traveller, and the traveller is the client who is like paying to have a service provided. And in international development, it's about the need in a community and trying to solve that. And so trying to meld those two things together, I think, is key to how some of these problems can arise. So what we saw happening over and again were things like volunteers misdirecting resources into what we call band-aid solutions. So solutions that don't actually really solve a problem, but that are easy to involve volunteer travelers in, that are there for a short time, and that maybe don't have skills that are specific to the problem or the region. Or we saw that there was examples of times when volunteers were more of a burden on a local organization than being a help, and that the organization was directing their resources towards kind of looking after volunteers and running a volunteer program. And as we were just talking about, the sort of colonial mentality that volunteers can often inadvertently bring with them, the idea that that there are people in other countries are sort of sitting around waiting for someone to come from outside to offer solutions to problems, when this is very far from the truth in almost all instances, that there actually are loads of local people working on problems, and that can be undermined by people coming in from outside and really not having an idea of the context. I think if we're looking at specific examples, the example that we found to be the most stark one in the book is that of orphanage volunteering. So this is something that I think that, you know, on the surface can sound really great, right? I want to volunteer overseas. I love kids. It's really easy to hang out with kids, and, you know, it's like a fun activity to do while you're on vacation, and all the kids need is, you know, some extra love. But actually, it's kind of being researched now, or, you know, many countries all over the world that through volunteers sort of in a way creating a demand for orphanage volunteering. What's happening is that there are more orphanages springing up to cater for that demand, and that, you know, the volunteers themselves are not necessarily bringing anything that would be you know, seen as beneficial to very vulnerable children. If you think about the levels of qualification that you need to work with vulnerable children in your own country, and, you know, most often volunteers don't bring any of that, and they can actually, you know, it can be really damaging for children that already maybe have abandonment issues or attachment disorders, to have like a short-term chain of untrained volunteers coming in to take care of them. And then, you know, like I said, it's sort of developed into an industry, in that as there are people that are willing to pay money for a certain experience, you know, like playing with kids or whatever, that sort of unscrupulous people looking to make money from that will then, you know, gather children together, label them as orphans, which we now know that the vast majority of children all over the world living in orphanages are not actually orphans. And, you know, there are many examples, again, of those children actually being trafficked to almost basically to provide a tourist attraction. So this is, you know, one of those examples in the book where we sort of highlight how, you know, this what starts off as a really good intention can go so badly wrong that you're being involved in trafficking and the exploitation of those very children that you went to help.
Thank you. It is so hard and so important to think about international aid and volunteering in, you know, within this framework of supply and demand. And that's something, you know, we see both the disasters or situations that we respond to because of a natural disaster or in direct response to an event, but then thinking about, oh wow, that as more and more people want to go to orphanages, it makes sense. It's hard to say. It makes sense why that would create a demand for that industry, and that often volunteer tourism often is so closely tied to human trafficking. I want to talk a little bit more about skill sets, and that's, I mean, the skill set that I'm most often looking for is clowning and performing. So we're looking for performers and often teaching artists. But this question of, is volunteering an opportunity to learn something new, or is it a time to be using skills that you already have? And I'd love to talk about that, and then maybe especially within the context of working with children.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the short answer that I have to that is that it can be both, right? Both volunteering to offer skills and to learn skills, but that you have to be really clear with yourself and with, you know, your volunteer hosts, which of that it is more, and especially if it's that you're really wanting to learn something, it's something that maybe you don't have a skill in already, that you make sure that there are systems in place that will support you in that volunteer placement. So, you know, just to sort of give some sort of more general rules on it. I think the first thing that I would say is that whatever you're doing as a volunteer should be something that you would feel comfortable in doing in your home setting, right? So if you are already a qualified teacher, then volunteering in an education setting might be appropriate. A lot of times it's seen that something like teaching English is something that you don't need any specific skills for. And I think if anyone has had experience of trying to teach in a classroom, they'll know it's sort of actually it is something that you'll be letting the children down unless you've had experience and qualification in that. But if you're interested in learning how to be a teacher, or you think that it's a career that you want to go into, then looking for opportunities like being a classroom assistant, where you can support rather than replace a local teacher. You can be in the classroom with the teacher and, do small group work with children, or, make sure that the local teacher is, the position of them is not kind of challenged by your, turning up and saying, okay, like I'm going to be the teacher now. So thinking in that way. So the first rule is like, don't do anything abroad that you wouldn't do at home. In terms of, like what would you do with children? Well, certainly if you're not highly qualified, you definitely wouldn't be able to walk into, a school or a residential care home, anything like that, unless you had very specialist qualifications. Just think about how crazy it would be in your own country if a tourist just rocked up, wearing shorts and taking photos and being like, hey, I'd like to, come in and play with the kids for a bit. If that seems weird in your home setting, then it can seem equally as weird doing it overseas. But I think, the second thing to consider is that even if you can do it at home, it doesn't guarantee that then you're able to do it abroad. So, a really experienced accountant, let's say, that is wanting to go and share accountancy skills might need to consider that if they're going into a low resource setting, that the place that they're going to might not have the hardware or the software that accountant is used to. Things like cultural appropriateness need to be considered. We've often found stories of people saying that actually it wasn't, like someone can be highly skilled, but if they're not being culturally sensitive, then they weren't actually able to transfer any of those skills because they were acting in ways that local people found inappropriate or sometimes aggressive. So, it's about, I guess, having the humility that even if you are highly skilled and highly experienced, try to realize that there's actually a lot of things that you still need to learn. And then thinking about other aspects of how, when someone comes in from outside, even if they've got a lot of skills, they might need to have a huge investment of resources in that person, such as, translator or something like that, or, people transporting that person out to different areas. That actually might be better done by less qualified but local people. So I think there's lots of things wrapped up in that. But if you're looking at, your own skill set, the first thing to remember, the first thing I think is to realize that everyone from, your like 15-year-old school volunteer has skills that will be useful, and how to appropriately put them in place, and to always feel like the activity that you're doing is not something that you feel like is just beyond what you're capable of doing. And I think a lot of volunteers felt there was pressure, felt like, oh, if I didn't do it, then no one would. But that is rarely the case, and that kind of mindset is the kind of thing that will then could very easily lead to people doing more harm than good.
Thank you. And for anyone who's just joining, welcome. I'm interviewing Claire Bennet, one of the authors of Learning Service. And that question of doing work within your skill set and balancing as a volunteer kind of what you can do well and your own expectation for yourself is actually something that I wrote about on the Learning Service blog. I, as a 17-year-old, had a volunteer opportunity where I was sort of given this responsibility that was so much bigger than my skill set, and so we found a way to adjust it. I pretty much made tea, sometimes made faces at babies. Two things I can do, and did not do any of those jobs that I couldn't do. But that question of, am I doing enough? I remember, well, having that question at the time, and then, I mean, it's a question I ask myself almost every day, and that pressure to do well is real. It's something that when I'm working with teams of CWB artists, one of the hardest pressures is sometimes we'll be asked to do more performances, and it can be hard. It can be hard to take that break as a team and say, can we really do this? Can we add on another show and still do it well? And I know that there's a whole section of the book around looking at motivations for volunteering. And I'm wondering if we could take a moment of, Claire, what are some of the questions that you think volunteers should ask themselves about why they want to volunteer, and maybe especially internationally?
Yeah, this is a huge part of the book. As you mentioned, it really starts with the question of asking yourself why you want to volunteer and to look at your motivations. I think one of the most important things is about being honest with yourself. You know, if you can identify why it is you want to do something, then you can analyze, you know, whether those goals are really going to be best filled by volunteering. So, you know, usually when people really kind of analyze and get down to it, there's a whole range of motivations about why you might want to volunteer. And we usually say that, you know, it's best to have a balance between personal goals and what we call like altruistic goals. You know, personal goals might be, I just really want to go to that country, or I want to learn a language, or, you know, I need something from my CV, or, you know, my personal statement to get into college. And then, you know, altruistic goals are things like really wanting to help a certain cause, or really wanting to contribute the skills that you have. And we kind of see problems emerging if it's too much one way or the other. You know, if it's really a lot of focus on the personal, then it really might be that volunteering isn't the right choice. There might be other things, like maybe you need to study, or maybe you need to do some educational travel. But also, if it's the other way, if it's like, you know, actually I just want to save this or achieve this, that's when people can set really unrealistic goals and, you know, either just end up really disappointed, or, you know, find out that in pushing to do all these things that they might actually do harm. So yeah, that's a major question that you need to ask. And then we go through in the book lots of different questions and, you know, points to consider, sort of really highlighting what a huge kind of choice this is, even if you're going for a short time. We sort of say as well that it's important to locate your specific choice to go and volunteer within a broader context. So, you know, we mentioned colonialism, you know, there's other huge things like global inequality and passport privilege, you know, things that mean that if you're someone who has been considering volunteering abroad, that you have that ability and privilege to be able to do that. It's rare that it happens the other way. So, to be asking why that is, and to think about, how the actions that you're taking are helping to redress that. So yeah, and in fact, we always say that the main impact of any volunteer trip is about what you do when you return anyway. So I think one of the biggest questions that people that are embarking on a volunteer trip are asking is like, how am I going to ensure that I use this, that I take this educational experience and I bring it forward in my life? Because, whatever amount of time you spend abroad, you definitely will have more time and more ability to make big impacts on these issues as you go forward in your life, with your career or with your consumer choices or, the kind of activism you get involved in. And so setting this up from the beginning and thinking, what, if you identify why it is that you want to go, to also be thinking about how is this going to be fuel for things that I'm going to go on to do, which is exciting, right? It's like the volunteer journey never stops.
That's really exciting. And I want to open it up. If anyone who's watching on Facebook Lives, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And Claire, thank you so much for bringing up the sort of this question of what happens when you get home, what happens after the 3-week, 3-month engagement for the volunteer. And I also want to talk a little bit about sustainability for the project partner or for the host, and what that can look like. This question of, is the volunteer doing a job that then the project is going to end when the volunteer leaves, or is it going to be filled by someone else? So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think sustainability is, again, a really important thing for volunteers and volunteer hosts to consider, and to have that in the initial part of the planning, rather than for it to sort of come up near the end when a volunteer is about to leave. So, I think there's a couple of things that just to sort of bear in mind with all international volunteer situations, is that it's almost by default that the volunteers will be short-term, and short-term might be, several months or several years sometimes, but it's, there's a defined period, and that they're almost always outsiders as well. So with that in mind, that's the kind of framing for how is a volunteer experience going to be set up. Like you mentioned, Naomi, if someone comes in and does a job, they might do that job really, really well. So let's say it's a very skilled nurse that goes to a rural area and, works as a nurse. But then when they leave, that community is not any better off. They're sort of reliant on someone coming in from outside again. Whereas, someone like a skilled nurse coming in from outside, working alongside a local health worker, making sure that, the power and status of that local person is bolstered, rather than sort of, the person coming from outside being more powerful or taking that job or whatever, actually showing that they support them, and that building trust in the local systems, building capacity in the local systems, and then it's possible that after some time, when that person leaves, what they're leaving behind is a system that is actually running better, or there's more skills or resources or something left behind, or at the very least that there isn't a void left behind when that person leaves. So yes, it's tricky to get right. I think a lot of volunteer organizations struggle with that, you know, like how do we provide extra resources in a way that will mean that we don't need to keep doing that forever.
Thanks. It's one of the big questions that comes up for CWB, because we often our programs we have two main types of program. One are the performance tours, which are short engagements. The clowns arrive, almost all of the performers are traveling internationally to do the work. It's a short engagement. When the clowns go home, it ends. And then another type of program that we started in part as a response to this question is really offering capacity building and some training to incredible clown organizations that are working in places where there is protracted displacement, where there is an ongoing need. And that's a way so that the work continues beyond the 3-week CWB tour. But in some of my other work, I'm working with these two incredible teaching volunteers, and I'm counting their hours, because I know that when their term ends, when they no longer need the college credit, we're going to need the funding to pay for teaching assistants. We have a couple questions. One is from Samantha Holdsworth. Hi, Sam. Which is, how can we support volunteers better? So that's maybe a we as Clowns Without Borders, or also a we as host organizations, and maybe also what support can a volunteer look for from the program they're working with?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Again, it's always a balance. I think when we're looking at volunteer support, in order for a volunteer to be effective, there's a certain level of support that they need. It varies depending on who you're working with, how experienced they are, how old they are. You know, lots of different factors will be in place. But like I said before, it can go the other way in that if organizations are really set up to give a lot of support and kind of, you know, end up sort of directing a lot of their resources towards making sure that volunteers are well set up and comfortable, it can be that it really detracts from the organization's main kind of focus of work. So I think the first question is to look at that, like what resources do we have available for volunteer support and where are they best placed? And I think, you know, in a lot of cases, something like a volunteer training course that is either pre-departure or, you know, at the beginning of when a volunteer has arrived in a country, that's something that is usually not a huge amount of investment, but can have a huge amount of benefit. I think, you know, a lot of the processes that we go through in the Learning Service book is really this sort of process of self-reflection, you know, self-analysis and getting, you know, volunteers in this mindset of how will they really take advantage of the volunteer experience, how will they be open to all of the learning, how will they be ensured that they're you know, processing all of these things, and also getting people used to and kind of prepared for the fact that, yeah, they may be really uncomfortable. They may get really frustrated, actually, because if we were going, you know, into circumstances where everything was running really smoothly, then you know, there may not be this massive resource disparity that we're trying to address. If you only wanted to remain in places that were really comfortable, then, you know, I wouldn't recommend going abroad, or, you know, trying to operate in a different cultural context, or even like going to places that have really different climates and, you know, resource settings and things like that. So it's often about reframing some of those things and saying, like, yes, like, you can go and you're offering something, but you're also gaining a huge amount, and how do you make sure that it counts? So some kind of training, and then also some kind of support that goes throughout the time that a volunteer is abroad. This is often where I feel like you know, some experiences get into it being a bit more kind of vacation-y, I suppose, where it's like, you know, organizations might be really catering to volunteers that are like, oh, I'd like to go and see this thing, or, you know, after doing a few days of work, then saying, oh, you know, like, I'm going to go on safari for a bit, or something like that. And I think another thing with the expectation setting at the beginning is, you know, what work is actually required, and what is the volunteer being relied on for, and making sure that the volunteers not really seeing it as, you know, optional, or, you know, as a vacation, but as basically as a job. If you're committing to a volunteer role, there shouldn't be any difference in commitment just because you're not getting paid. But, you know, but again, like, I think because it can be very challenging, and because there can be situations that come up, there can be emergencies, like any volunteer or volunteer organization that went through, I think it was March really, where everything just, you know, like went totally off in a direction that was completely uncharted, you know, like volunteers were having to decide whether they evacuated their placements. Things were changing on a daily basis. Countries were shutting their borders, you know, flights were being cancelled. And it's important that volunteer companies are like, you know, have assessed those risks and are offering support for volunteers. And then I also think that a part that gets missed a lot is support for volunteers once they return, especially if a volunteer has been in either a very intense and traumatic situation, as I know Clowns Without Borders often goes to areas that are disaster zones and conflict zones, either that kind of situation, or if they've been somewhere for a longer period of time, you know, for like several months, that reintegration back into their home country can be really hard. And I think good volunteer support organizations spend time firstly debriefing that with the volunteers, ensuring that they're prepared for it, and then giving ways in which the volunteers can engage with, you know, the organization or the cause afterwards. Because I think, like many of us, like I will, you know, hands up, I have done lots of volunteering in my life. Some of it I now look back on kind of regretfully, and, you know, I'm quite honest about a lot of the mistakes that I've made in the learning service book, huge numbers of examples. But, you know, I will also say that those experiences really shaped me. And, you know, I was able to take that learning from those experiences and yeah, like turn it into a whole load of like work for impact, let's say, that has happened in the future and that still is happening. And that I think volunteer organizations can have a huge role to play in how that happens. And it can be of mutual benefit as well. If a volunteer gets really passionate about the work that's going on overseas, they can be your biggest advocate, and yeah, like get really involved. They can volunteer, they can continue to volunteer. Now, you know, everything's done on Zoom, so it sort of doesn't matter where you're located. You know, they can fundraise, they can raise awareness, they can, you know, get involved in all kinds of ways in their own lives in the future. And so yeah, so it's really worthwhile doing that, but they only will do that if you've put the support that's in place throughout the time to sort of to sort of scaffold that, so that so that both the volunteer and the organization feel like it's been like a mutually beneficial arrangement.
Thank you. And we have two questions that to me seem like they tied together. One from Shakriya of what could a short-term unskilled volunteer do to be more responsible and impactful, sort of how to increase that impact. And then Christian is asking about general resources or organizations to prepare volunteers to operate in a specific cultural context and with populations who have experienced trauma. So Claire, as you think about that, I'm going to put in a plug for the Learning Service book and website, which Chris, this has become a resource that we at Clowns Without Borders use. That's not country specific, but there's some really good questions. It's certainly helped me think in terms of like, oh, what are ways to create support? What are questions to be asking about the place that we're going or the population we're working with? And Shakriya, there are also some really concrete ways to increase the impact, sort of like Claire said, of advocacy beforehand, during, and after. And then Claire, I want to know what else.
Okay, so I'll take the question of what can a unskilled volunteer do to improve their impact. So I did say before that I don't think there isn't really anyone in the world that is unskilled. It's about like, matching your skills with an appropriate situation. But, like that question, I think, is probably the most common question that we get asked here at Learning Service. Like, I would say like every few weeks we get an email like that. It's often from like a concerned parent that is like, my 15-year-old is going to, an African country and, wants to get involved in this and this and this, and what's the best organization, or, where can she have the most impact? And, often with this question, we kind of, in some ways, play devil's advocate a little bit. And, especially if it's, someone that is young, probably the first time going to that country, often the first time traveling, that it doesn't have a huge amount of professional or life experience and is going for a short period of time. We'll often throw that question back and say like, hey, like, why do you feel the pressure to volunteer, especially at this time, especially when you know that you've got very strict parameters that are limiting the amount of impact that you're going to have? Because, something that we do say a lot in the Learning Service book is that having an impact is something that is kind of complex. It's definitely not impossible. We're definitely not trying to discourage people from volunteering, but we are asking people to really reflect on it and think about it, and to say that, really, if you've you have these motivations that you really want to go, but you know that you're not going to be able to offer a huge amount in terms of skills or time, then that there are probably other things that you can do with that time that in your bigger impact, if we're looking at like this life impact, might be more useful. Because the more you try and cram into your like short time abroad, the more likely that is to sort of fall into some of these pitfalls that we talk about. In Learning Service, we say it's not about how you save the world in a week. It's about what you do with the 358 other days of the year. So if you put it that way, what is the most impactful thing that you can do with your short time that you're going to spend abroad? Often what we'll say is that it's some form of educational travel, where you're not acting or trying to do something or achieve something, where you might be going to talk to local people, experience and explore some of the issues that you might be passionate about working on, really understand the context, maybe, you know, meet activists and organizations that are doing things on the ground, and ask, you know, what is it that's difficult? What is it that's needed? And then, you know, you can realize that actually you being there for that short time almost certainly isn't what is needed to solve that. But it doesn't mean that you can't be part of the puzzle. Like, maybe there are things you can do when you go back. Maybe you can plan to go and do something in that country in the future. You know, I've known lots of people that have come on an educational trip that's been very short term. And then, you know, they've been at university studying the language of that place because they know that they're going to go back, because they had like some kind of light bulb moment that went off. So I would say that especially if you're feeling pressured in choosing to go and volunteer, then there is like no reason for that pressure to be there. And the question of resources and what resources are out there. So as Naomi said, in the Learning Service Book, we tried to not make it culture specific. We did research in all continents and, you know, tried to pull in, when we were talking about like cultural examples, we were looking at, you know, cultures from all over the world, and just to use it as examples, because that very specific research, which is really important if you're going to go on a volunteer placement, is something that might even be specific to that particular context or region. So, for example, you know, volunteering in a refugee camp, the culture of that camp, you know, it might be an ethnic group that isn't, you know, particularly represented by the people in that country. There might be other factors that will mean that the way in which you need to communicate and interact with that group, that there's, you know, certain kind of either cultural or because of like, you know, conflict or trauma, different things. So those things are really important. And one of the ways that I would suggest trying to find out that is by relying on kind of local people and local sources and local organizations to help recommend things from that specific country and culture. And if you're finding that you can't really get that, you know, if like an organization is not forthcoming, then that's maybe a time where you can start to reconsider, like, you know, does this organization have enough resources to support me? Especially like, you know, my own experience of sort of living in a disaster zone was in the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. And what happened in that context is, you know, a huge wave of people that were turning up because maybe they'd been on holiday in Nepal and they really liked it, or maybe they did have some affiliation to Nepal before, or they just felt moved because they saw images on the TV of devastation, turning up, really having no idea about how to get involved or what to do, not knowing the language, not knowing the culture. Because it was a disaster zone, there was already things like a shortage of food that was, you know, like people that didn't have houses anymore were just being fed in big camps. And there were stories of volunteers turning up to those camps in order to get handouts of food. You know, they were actually taking away the resources that were there for local people. So I would say that unless it's organized in a way where you feel like well briefed, like I said, is there a training where you feel like there's access to resources that are specific to that context, then you might be asking questions about whether it's being ethically run. But yes, I hope that answers your question. I know that it's not as specific, other than to say that your question is very important, and that level of research at the beginning is sort of critical to whether you're going to be an effective volunteer.
Thank you. Oh, time flies. This is such a big topic. If you're watching, I would love to know if this is something topic you'd love to know more about from CWB. Something we've been talking about is, can we be using this time to really make our resources of how we work with artists a little more polished and more public. So if that's something that you would be interested in seeing, let us know. I want to talk about clowning for our last 10 minutes. I'm crying now. Oh no, this happens every week. One is, Claire, I know that you've actually seen CWB perform. Oh no. And I'm wondering if you can tell that story. I'm going to turn the video off. Can you tell me what it was like to see CWB perform?
Yes. Oh no, of course I can. I know that we spoke about this ourselves on a previous occasion. But I think I was very surprised. That's the first thing that I'm going to say, is that like I said, I'd never been in a disaster zone, and I hadn't sort of signed up to it either. Nepal is my home. I'm not there right now because of pandemic reasons. I think we're all lots of us find ourselves in unusual situations, but I still consider Nepal my home. And after, that a devastating event like that, everyone's kind of in shock and nobody knows what to do. Everyone wants to do something, and huge aid agencies come in and they have their own ways of operating, which is really comforting in lots of ways, that someone comes in that's kind of done this before and that can set up systems and like support people that are going through horrendous trauma of having lost their homes and family members and things like that. But it, and then cater to all the basic needs of people. But it really did seem at the time that it was a very sort of practical and I guess it was like a logistical problem that everyone was trying to solve. It was like, do we have enough toilets? Like, we're running out of cooking oil. These kind of things that, in the kind of IDP camps that I had experience of sort of working in or being near. And like I said, like a lot of chaos, a lot of very high kind of emotions as people were trying to work things out, and it was just very hard, I think. And I just did not expect, that was the last thing on my mind to expect, that there was another organization that showed up to the IDP, by the way, is internally displaced persons camp. So it's like, they were like refugees, but within their own country. And and some clowns showed up. And that was the last thing that I thought people would be offering as like aid. And in lots of ways, I guess, at that time when everyone was like, do we have enough food and all of this? I guess, I was just thinking, well, why would we think that that's, like, that's what we need? And then it was just really amazing to sort of see a community spirit, amongst a lot of people that were just sort of flung together, that, were people that were in the IDP camp didn't necessarily know each other before, tragedy struck. That was what they had in common. And to realize that actually the biggest, I think probably the biggest issue that was underlying everything at that time was deep trauma, that none of us had the space to recognize was what was really affecting everyone. And so the opportunity to kind of laugh, for children to just feel like there was something exciting, rather than, many of the children just didn't really have much of an idea of what was going on, and that, why that the adults were sort of behaving in the kind of ways that they were, and to just allow that release of tension. I think, it was something that, and the expression as well, because it wasn't just, what I saw was not just you know, a sort of a polished performance of clowns that were like giving something to the audience, but it was really about involving the audience and getting the kids to express themselves. And I think that was an opportunity that up until that point they hadn't really had. And so it did make me sort of reframe, you know, what is needed at a time like that.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yes, just gonna cry about clowns a little. I believe that was Clowns Without Borders, Clowns and Magicians Without Borders, Belgium, and I meant to have a whole deck of photos ready to go to share right now, and maybe later today. Claire, thank you so much. We've had such a wonderful hour with you, and this book truly has reshaped how I think about the work. It's one of the kind of best and hardest pieces of our mission, is that for Clowns Without Borders is a moment of joy. And sometimes I think, oh, but that's so small. Can we be doing more? And your book really helped ground this, the importance of really naming, okay, what is the impact that we want to make? And that for us, it's saying, okay, when we visit a community, and maybe we're there for a day, maybe we're there for 3 hours, the goal is a moment of joy, and to be specific also about what is our work when we're not performing, what is the work of advocacy and sharing stories. So thank you so much, audience on Facebook.